I moved back to the lake after the worst year of my life. People talk about grief like it's something you survive, something you process, something you eventually outgrow. They say you just need time. But after I lost Sarah and our son in that car crash, I didn't want time. I wanted silence. I wanted solitude. I wanted the kind of emptiness that would let my pain echo without judgment. That lake, our lake, was the only place left that didn't remind me of what I had lost. It was the place we used to come to on weekends back before the promotion, the meetings, the soccer tournaments, and everything else life threw at us. The lake had always stayed the same cold, still deep, and mine. I had inherited the land from my Uncle James, a reclusive hydrologist who had spent decades studying water systems for the state before buying the entire surrounding basin in the early 70s. Most people never realized the lake wasn't public. There were no signs, no fences. Just a long gravel drive through the pines and the quiet hush of water waiting for morning. After the funeral, I left everything behind: the city, the house, the firm. I packed what little I needed into my truck and drove 6 hours north until I crossed the wooden bridge that led to the property. The cabin was old, but solid, built into the slope that faced the water. I didn't touch the internet for months. I lit fires, cooked simple meals, chopped wood, and sat on the dock until sunrise. The HOA didn't matter to me back then. I didn't even know we had one, not in any real sense. There were signs near the old subdivisions around the main road, Fresh Pine Village, Willow Bend, but they seemed more decorative than anything else. My land wasn't even in their boundaries, or so I thought. It started with a letter, a small envelope left in my mailbox down the hill where the county road cuts through. No return address, just the words, Fresh Pine Lakeside HOA Notice of Community Integration. Inside was a neatly typed form informing me that my lake had been voluntarily designated as a shared amenity space. Shared. That word echoed in my skull like a gunshot. I nearly laughed. Voluntarily by who? The letter went on to describe a proposed partnership with a private investor to revitalize the underutilized lakefront experience. At the bottom was a line that made my stomach clench. Preliminary development permits pending. It didn't make sense. The lake was mine. I'd paid taxes on it for 15 years. It wasn't even zoned for commercial use, and the only access road ran through my land. I tore the letter in half, tossed it in the fireplace, and told myself it was probably a mistake. Bureaucratic overreach, some intern checking boxes. Then came the boats. 2 weeks later, I heard engines on the water. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of black coffee when I saw the pontoon slowly drifting toward the center of the lake. On board were 2 men in polos and sunglasses, measuring sticks in hand, talking and laughing like they owned the place. I shouted from the dock, told them they were trespassing. They waved like I was some friendly neighbor and kept going. The next morning, there were orange flags tied to trees. Survey markers, staked along the southern bank where the willow trees grew low and thick. I followed them down to the edge and found a laminated sign zip-tied to a branch. Site approved for floating platform development, Fresh Pine HOA. A number at the bottom. I called it, straight to voicemail. I should have known then that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. But I didn't want to believe anyone could be so arrogant, so outright unlawful. I'd been a city engineer for over 20 years before retirement. I knew how permits worked. I knew how property lines were drawn, how water rights were managed, how ecological surveys had to be conducted for any development near a freshwater system. So I drove into town. I brought my deed, the land surveys, even an old aerial map Uncle James had tucked away in his workroom. The county clerk pulled up their digital files and shook her head. No shared rights recorded, no HOA jurisdiction. You're the sole owner, Mr. Holloway. I nodded tight-lipped and left before the sun went down. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next week, a flatbed truck arrived with lumber and steel framing. They didn't even bother using the main road. They cut through a small maintenance trail that had once been used to haul gravel, pushing it down to the lakeshore like it was theirs. I stood on the bluff and watched 4 men unload materials onto a floating platform that hadn't been there the day before. It must have been pre-assembled somewhere else and towed in. By noon, they had a small team bolting sections together. I called the sheriff. He came out in the afternoon, a local kid I remembered from high school, Deputy Nolan. He scratched his head as I showed him the documents, then talked to the contractors. He returned to me after an hour, shrugging. They say they have permission from the HOA. The HOA doesn't own this lake. I understand, sir, but I can't confirm that without a property dispute process. That takes time. So while they're disputing ownership, they get to build a restaurant in the middle of my lake. I suggest you contact a lawyer. I looked him in the eye. They're trespassing, right now. Until the court says otherwise, it's not that simple. He left with a soft apology and a warning not to escalate. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and waited. But that night I didn't sleep. I went down to the dock with a flashlight, opened the rusted hatch I hadn't touched in 10 years, and climbed down the concrete steps to the underground vault. The smell of wet stone and iron filled my nose. There, still bolted in place, was the system my uncle had once shown me, a low-pressure sluice gate that controlled the outflow to the retention channel. The channel was narrow, buried beneath the southern ridge, nearly forgotten by time. I ran my hand along the cold steel wheel, untouched, waiting. I didn't know what I'd do next, but something had shifted inside me. They thought I was just some broken old man with no fight left in him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next few days brought a quiet I didn't trust. The trucks were gone. The hammering stopped. The contractors vanished. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe the message had finally gotten through, that maybe my confrontation with Deputy Nolan had at least scared them enough to pull the brakes. I wanted to believe in reason, in paperwork, in justice, but I should have known better. On a chilly Wednesday morning, I walked out to the dock with a thermos in one hand and binoculars in the other. The lake's surface was glass smooth, still and reflective like it always had been. But something had changed. Out near the center, too far to make out clearly, was a shape, low, wide, and unnatural. My stomach twisted. I raised the binoculars slowly, heart already pounding before I even focused the lens. There it was. Floating like a parasite in the middle of my lake sat a massive modular platform anchored with thick steel tethers. A rectangular foundation of what looked like treated timber and aluminum float barrels. And on top of it, framework. Metal beams, support structures, A-frame outlines, roof brackets. It wasn't just a platform anymore. They were building a permanent structure. A building, right in the middle of my lake. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe. Long enough for the thermos to cool in my hand and my breath to turn sharp in the morning air. My legs finally moved slow and numb, and I walked up the path toward my garage. I unlocked the side door, stepped inside, and pulled down the dusty metal case that had sat on the highest shelf since the day I retired. Inside were blueprints, maps, original documents from the Department of Environmental Resources. I flipped through them page after page until I found the one I wanted, the 1972 Hydrological Rights Registration for parcel num H118403. Private water reserve wholly owned by James Holloway. Under the subsection marked Use Restrictions was the clause I remembered by heart. Any construction or alteration upon the water body shall require explicit consent from the title holder of the surrounding basin. There was no HOA clause, no shared designation, no ambiguity. I scanned the page, saved the document, and emailed it straight to a land rights attorney I had worked with years ago on a boundary dispute. He replied within 2 hours. You're right, and they're dead wrong. His advice was swift and clinical. Send a cease and desist cite, the hydrological registration, give them 48 hours. If they continue, file for an emergency injunction in county court. I thanked him, printed the letter, and drove to the HOA office the next morning. The building was new, modern, sterile, with chrome siding and tinted glass that tried a little too hard to look upscale. I parked in visitor parking and walked inside. The receptionist barely glanced up. I'm here to deliver a cease and desist letter for the Fresh Pine HOA board, I said, placing the sealed envelope on the counter. She raised an eyebrow. About the lake? Yes. Her lips twitched, a smirk quickly buried. They're in a meeting. Then make sure they get it. As I turned to leave, a door to the side opened, and a woman stepped out, mid-40s, sharp-shouldered, suit, thin-framed glasses, and the kind of expression that screamed HOA royalty. She looked me up and down like I was a noise complaint. Mr. Holloway, she said. I am. I'm Cheryl Blake. I'm the interim HOA president. I understand you've raised some concerns about the lake. It's not a concern, I said evenly. It's a trespass. That's private property, and you're about to be on the wrong side of the law." Her smile didn't waver. "We have extensive documentation suggesting otherwise." "I'd love to see it," I said, "since the county doesn't have a single shred backing your claim." She folded her arms. "We'll have our legal counsel review your letter. But you should know we're already weeks into this development. It's a shared community project. It's very popular. I don't care if it's the second coming of Disneyland. If you don't pull off that lake in 48 hours, I'll have a judge pull you off by force." I walked out before she could respond. My heart was thudding, but not from nerves, from rage. I could already see the game they were playing. Bury me in delay, force me to sue. By the time it hit court, they'd be halfway done. They were counting on my exhaustion, on my grief, on my silence. But I had no intention of staying silent. Back home, I took photographs from every angle I could manage. Drone shots, dock level shots, nighttime zooms. I started a file. I called the county's zoning board and made an appointment. I even reached out to a retired local journalist who ran a blog on shady HOA practices. She was eager to help. And still, every morning I woke up and saw more progress. Walls began rising from the floating foundation. Tall arched windows went up. Wiring snaked across scaffolds. A deck was built. Workers laughed, played music smoked on breaks. The water echoed every sound, bouncing it back to me like mockery. Then came the lights. Bright white spotlights mounted on the roof's edge, casting hard glares across the entire surface of the lake, beaming straight into my bedroom window. At night, the lake no longer felt like home. It felt like a theme park. I finally snapped on a Sunday night around 2 a.m., when the music from a test run of their restaurant speakers shook the cabin walls. I stormed to the dock with a megaphone, shouted for them to cut it out, told them I'd press criminal charges. Someone shouted back from the floating deck, "Go back to bed, old man." That was it. The next morning, I pulled out the full blueprint of the lake's infrastructure. The drainage channel, the pressure lines, the mechanical system buried beneath layers of soil and time. My Uncle James hadn't just owned the land. He'd controlled it. He'd engineered it. And I still had the keys. I unlocked the hatch again. This time I brought tools. The cease and desist had been delivered. The legal documents had been sent. I had photographic evidence, hydrological registration zoning maps, historical land deeds, all the ammunition I needed for any halfway competent judge to shut this circus down. But none of it mattered to the Fresh Pine HOA. Instead of retreating, they escalated. 2 days after Cheryl Blake had smiled through my warning, I received a thick packet in the mail from a firm I'd never heard of, Montgomery & Kravis, HOA Legal Affairs Division. Inside was a stack of documents filled with formal jargon, and just enough passive aggression to make it feel like a personal assault. At the heart of it was a claim I hadn't expected. The lake, as part of the visually accessible commons, is subject to implied easement rights under HOA easement overlays and customary use provisions. Visual access, customary use. They were arguing that because residents could see the lake, and because they had occasionally used it for non-motorized recreation, it was functionally integrated into community use and therefore fair game for development. It was nonsense. A legal Hail Mary thrown by people who had no right to touch the water, let alone build on it. But they were trying to twist perception into possession, and they were confident enough to commit it to paper. I brought the documents to my lawyer. He looked at them, scoffed, and said flatly, "They're stalling. They know they're wrong, but they're buying time. They want you to lose steam." "I won't," I said. "Good, because they'll test every inch of your patience." And they did. The following weekend, a glossy, full-color flyer appeared in every resident's mailbox. Coming soon, Lakeside Ember Fresh Pine's floating culinary experience. There were mock-ups of a modern cedar-paneled restaurant bobbing gently on the water, filled with smiling couples and sunset cocktails. They even had a local chef's face plastered on the back with a quote, "We're proud to serve where nature meets elegance." It made my blood boil. But it wasn't just the propaganda, it was the reaction. Residents began driving out to the lake on weekends to take selfies near the construction. Some paddled up on rented kayaks and waved to the builders. I could hear their conversations drifting across the water. "Oh my God, this will be so great for property values. I heard it's going to be farm to table. I can't believe they're finally using this space. It's been wasted for years." I wanted to scream, but I didn't, not yet. Instead, I printed 150 copies of my own letter, one page, black and white, titled, "Important Legal Notice Regarding Unauthorized Construction on Private Property." I drove through the neighborhood hand-delivering each one to mailboxes and doorsteps. I included contact info, my lawyer's card, and a scanned copy of the original hydrological title. I explained that the lake was privately owned, that no community vote had been held, and that any liability resulting from continued unauthorized use could fall on individual residents who supported it. By Monday, my phone rang nonstop. Some were confused, some angry. A few were threatening, but a handful were apologetic. One older couple, the Wilkinsons, invited me in for coffee and told me they hadn't realized the HOA had overstepped. "We just assumed they had permission," the wife said. "They said it was approved unanimously. They never brought it up at a public meeting," her husband added. "Not once. I would have remembered. That was the first crack." It wasn't much, but it gave me hope that reason might still find a foothold. But Cheryl Blake and her board had other plans. On Tuesday, a letter appeared nailed to a tree near my driveway. No envelope, no formality. Just 6 words, scrawled in thick marker. "You don't own the water anymore." I stood staring at it for a long time, heart cold and steady. I didn't take it down. I didn't need to. It was already burned into my memory. Later that evening, I walked back to the hatch at the edge of the dock. The concrete slab was damp with dew, and the metal handle was cold in my palm. I pulled it open again, climbed down the ladder into the earth, and turned on the single bare bulb that still flickered dimly in the vault. The gate system was older than I remembered, rusted around the edges, thick with sediment, but it was intact. I ran my fingers along the pressure wheel, tracing the arc of its motion, remembering the lessons my uncle had taught me as a boy. "This system," he once said, "is like a whisper in a storm. No one hears it coming until the water's already gone." I checked the gauge. The pressure was still holding. If I opened the gates slowly, the lake would begin to drain within hours. If I opened them wide, it would be gone by morning. I didn't turn it. Not yet. But I stood there for a long time listening to the silence. The next day, I filed the official injunction with the county court. It would take 7-10 days to get on the docket, but at least it was in motion. My attorney advised me not to make any sudden moves. "We're on solid ground legally," he said. "Just let them keep digging their own grave." I tried. I really did. But the HOA wasn't just digging, they were dancing on mine. That Friday, they held a private preview party on the platform. I watched from the bluff as golf carts pulled up on the gravel road they had cleared through a side lot I didn't even know existed. Dozens of people, dressed in casual resort wear, stepping onto my lake, like it was a stage built just for them. There was music, laughter, champagne flutes, lights strung from the rafters of the half-finished building, children splashing in kayaks, servers handing out hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. At one point, I saw Cheryl herself standing at the edge of the platform, holding a microphone, her voice echoing faintly over the water. "And thanks to your continued support, we've turned an underused space into the beating heart of Fresh Pine's future. This lake belongs to all of us." The applause that followed felt like a slap. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to hold back the scream rising in my throat. They had declared war, and I knew deep in my bones I would answer. It was supposed to be a soft launch. That's what the flyer said. Lakeside Ember, exclusive grand preview event, VIPs only. The flyers were slipped into mailboxes on glossy cardstock, thick as wedding invitations, with gold leaf and cursive script. Apparently, HOA members and select residents were to be treated to a preview of the ambiance menu and panoramic lakefront experience. Panoramic lakefront experience. That's what they called it now. I sat at my window with the lights off, coffee untouched, watching a line of headlights snake through the subdivision and onto the gravel path, my path that they'd forcibly widened with bulldozers the week before. I hadn't even been notified. They claimed it was public easement usage, as if that made tearing through my property somehow acceptable. They'd even paved over part of it with stamped concrete, trying to blend their violations into suburban charm. By sundown, the floating restaurant glowed like a lantern on the water. They'd strung fairy lights along the railings, rigged soft uplighting beneath the platform, so it shimmered in the lake's reflection, and installed small spotlights on nearby trees to highlight the path like it was part of some enchanted forest. It was manipulative, strategic, beautiful even, and it filled me with a rage so cold it felt surgical. I could hear the laughter and music from inside my cabin. Their voices spilled across the lake and up the hillside, bright and careless. Glasses clinked. Someone sang out-of-tune karaoke. It wasn't just noise, it was mockery. A celebration of theft. I wanted to go down there. I wanted to storm the deck and lay out the property deeds in front of their linen-covered tables. I wanted to drag Cheryl Blake off her little stage and make her say the words, "I trespassed. I lied. I stole." But I didn't. I didn't speak. I recorded. At exactly 7:08 p.m., I launched my drone small, silent, legally registered, and with the camera upgraded to 4K night mode. It flew low, hugging the dark curve of the tree line, then lifted gently over the water. From above, the restaurant looked like something out of a luxury brochure, modern architecture, candlelit tables, music rising from discreet, outdoor speakers. The drone captured it all. And then I turned the lens on the shoreline. What they didn't realize, what Cheryl and her board hadn't accounted for, was that in making the floating restaurant so large, they had to install stabilizing tethers that ran down through the lake bed and were anchored into the very bluff that I owned. They had drilled steel bolts directly into my land, and not just one or two. I counted 8. I zoomed in, clear as day. Unauthorized construction, destruction of private terrain, violation of setback ordinances, improper anchoring on residential property without permitting or consent. My lawyer was going to have a field day. Still watching wasn't enough. I needed to see it with my own eyes. Not from a drone, not from behind a window. I needed to stand there, to feel what had been taken. So just after 10 p.m., I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on my boots, and made my way down the hill through the woods, staying just off the cleared path. The music had slowed to soft jazz. The crowd had mellowed. Most of them were seated around the edge of the platform legs, dangling glasses in hand, enjoying the breeze. I reached the edge of the dock, the original one, the one my Uncle James built by hand 40 years ago. The restaurant now sat 100 feet from it, lit like a stage. I could see Cheryl near the bar, laughing with a group of investors. The bartender handed her a drink. She lifted it, toasted them, and said something that made them erupt in applause. That's when I stepped forward onto the dock and clicked on my flashlight. The beam shot across the water like a blade. People turned. Faces blinked toward the light. I didn't shout. I didn't wave. I just stood there. Cheryl saw me. I know she did. Her smile faltered for just a second, just enough to remind me she wasn't invincible. Then she turned away, whispering to someone behind her. A man in a navy polo security, I assumed, walked down the floating ramp and onto a skiff. He rowed toward me slowly, carefully, like I was a bear they didn't want to provoke. "You're not allowed to be here, sir," he called out. I chuckled. It wasn't even bitter, just tired. "Son, you are standing in the middle of my lake. You don't get to tell me where I'm allowed." He hesitated. "If you have complaints, please submit them to the board. I am the board of this lake, and I've already submitted. They just never responded." He looked back toward the platform. Cheryl was watching again, arms crossed. "I'm not here to cause a scene," I said, "but I promise you this isn't over." I turned off the flashlight and walked back up the hill. By the time I reached the cabin, the music had picked up again. Someone was playing trumpet. Laughter returned. The glow of the restaurant bled into the water like oil. I poured a whiskey, sat on the porch, and stared out at it all. They thought this was their triumph. They thought the grand opening would cement their claim. But I wasn't just holding papers anymore. I was holding a plan. At 3:00 a.m., when the last guest had left and only a few staff remained behind cleaning up, I went to the vault. The air was damp, the concrete cold beneath my boots. I reached for the pressure valve and gently gave it a test turn. It moved, smooth, obedient. I smiled. They wanted a lake. They were about to get mud. There's something sacred about the stillness of early morning, just before the sun stretches over the ridgeline. Back when Sarah and I used to come here on weekends, we'd rise before dawn, coffee in thermoses, blankets wrapped around our legs, and sit on the dock watching the lake exhale fog. The water was a mirror, then deep, undisturbed, alive. She used to say it felt like the lake was holding secrets. I always thought it was holding peace. But that morning all I could feel was betrayal. The lake no longer whispered, it groaned. The glow of the floating restaurant had finally dimmed. From my vantage point, I could still see the faint outlines of its angular roof and the crooked shadows of tables left out overnight. Empty wine glasses lined the deck railings. A string of decorative lights had come unmoored in the wind and now dragged in slow, lazy arcs across the lake's surface like a fishing line with no catch. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. My mind kept circling back to the vault, the valve, the pressure, and the memories. They always returned when I got quiet, when I stopped fighting long enough to let them in. Sarah's laughter in the canoe, our son Jake catching his first fish off the old dock, screaming like he'd discovered treasure. Their ashes were scattered in this lake, right near the southern bend where the lily pads grew thick in summer. It had been our sanctuary, our goodbye, and now it was being used to serve overpriced cocktails to people who didn't even know their names. I walked into the back room of the cabin and opened the old filing cabinet. Bottom drawer, still locked. I found the key tucked in a mason jar full of nails, opened the drawer, and pulled out the file labeled James Holloway Infrastructure Plans. There it was, the full layout. The lake wasn't just natural, it had been engineered. My uncle had spent years quietly reinforcing the natural basin, reinforcing the shoreline, with submerged levees building a narrow channel that ran under the southern bluff and fed into a buried spillway system, then into the wetlands a half-mile down. He hadn't done it for development. He did it to preserve the water, to protect it, and to control it. At the center of it all was the pressure release vault, the one I now stood as steward over. It wasn't a pump, not exactly. It was passive gravity-fed drainage connected to a gate valve that could be opened in increments. Fully opened, the lake could be drained in less than a day. Slowly opened, it could drop water levels inch by inch, nearly undetectable, until it was too late. I reread his handwritten notes on flow calculations and sediment ratios. Then I read his final scrawl in the margins. Only if necessary. Only if they forget who owns this land. I closed the file. They had forgotten. It was time I reminded them. But before I acted, I needed to make sure I had more than just the old blueprints. I drove to the county records office again that afternoon. The clerk, a different one this time, younger, more skeptical, gave me a raised eyebrow when I asked to review water management filings from the 70s. Most of those are digitized, she said, but they're hard to parse, old scans. I know what I'm looking for. After 2 hours at the terminal, I found the entry, registration number 4119B, Holloway, James E. Private Retention Reservoir. Attached to the document was a series of notes about the drainage infrastructure, including an amendment dated 1982 that reaffirmed the property owner's right to initiate full or partial water release in accordance with environmental flow regulations contingent on exclusive ownership of the basin and absence of municipal override. There was no override. I printed it. Then I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the state's Environmental Protection Agency to retrieve aerial records of lake levels over the past 2 decades. I needed to show that there was no municipal maintenance, no county involvement, no claim of shared oversight, just me, just my family. The documents would take a few days, but I could wait, barely. That evening, as I walked the perimeter of the lake, I came across something that made my blood run cold. It was another anchor point, this one half buried in the clay at the northern bend behind the trees. Freshly poured concrete, barely dry, with rebar poking through like broken bones. They were expanding the tethering system, reinforcing the restaurant's foundation, which meant they were preparing to make it permanent. I snapped pictures, measured the distance. It was 38 feet onto my land. 38 feet of trespass, violation, arrogance. When I got back to the cabin, I didn't go inside. I went straight to the dock. The air was cool, the water still, and beneath it the weight of memory. I unlocked the hatch, climbed down. The vault smelled of moss and iron. The floor was damp. A small pool of water collected in the lowest corner where condensation dripped from the stone ceiling. The valve sat in the center, like a sleeping beast, its wheel thick with time but unbroken. I knelt beside it and opened the maintenance panel, checked the indicator gauge. Everything was aligned. All it would take was one turn. Just one. But I didn't do it that night. Not yet. Because I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was planning. I called my attorney and told him I wanted to file a property damages claim in parallel to the injunction. I also asked if he could prepare a press release, something factual, tight, damning. He agreed. I contacted the retired journalist, again sent her every document, every photo, every drone video. She promised to run a full expose on her blog within 72 hours. She even knew someone at the local news station. Then I waited. And as I waited, I visited the vault every day. Like a ritual. Each time I touched the valve, I remembered more. The first time Sarah fell into the lake and laughed so hard she nearly choked. The way Jake used to stand on the dock in his life vest, like a captain, ready to set sail. The picnic we had one July 4th with sparklers and country music echoing off the trees. All of it was still here, suspended in the water, hovering just beneath the surface. And if I drained it all away, would I be erasing those memories? Or would I be honoring them? I sat in the vault that evening until the flashlight died. Until I couldn't see my hands in front of me. Just darkness. And the soft, steady drip of time. By the time I climbed out, I had made up my mind. They wanted to steal my memories. I would drown theirs. The air that night was still and heavy, thick with late summer heat and the hum of crickets chirping in the woods. I had waited long enough. The HOA had made it clear they weren't going to back down. The legal process was slow, too slow to keep up with the speed at which they were building advertising, celebrating. They had plans to host weddings on the floating restaurant I'd heard. Even applied for a liquor license. It was all happening faster than any court could stop. But I could stop it. The valve system was older than most of the houses in Fresh Pine. Hidden, forgotten, except by me. My Uncle James had built it with the kind of obsessive precision only a man who'd spent his life in government waterworks could possess. It was gravity-fed, passive, and silent. No pumps, no noise. Just the quiet, obedient logic of engineering. It wasn't designed for revenge. But that didn't mean it couldn't deliver it. I stepped into the vault again, just past 11 p.m. Flashlight and hand gear strapped to my back. I had packed gloves oil, a wrench, a crowbar, and a thick canvas cloth to catch any leaking sediment. The concrete walls were slick with condensation. The valve wheel stood before me like the helm of a buried ship waiting for its captain. I knelt beside it and began cleaning the grooves. My uncle had explained it to me when I was 12. I remembered the way he'd crouched beside me, resting a weathered hand on my shoulder. This gate works slow, he'd said. It's not like twisting a faucet. You open it too fast, the flow destabilizes the channel. Erosion, pressure, imbalance, even collapse. You open it gradually, an inch every hour, and the lake will empty itself smooth as a drawn breath. I checked the gauge. The system still held back over 16 feet of water. If I did this right, the lake would drain by morning. Maybe not bone dry, but enough to expose the mudflats. Enough to tip the balance under that shiny floating restaurant. Enough to ruin them. My hand wrapped around the valve wheel. It was stiff at first, resisting me like an old dog with a grudge. I applied slow, even pressure. It groaned, then shifted just a quarter inch. A deep hum echoed through the pipe beneath my feet, like the sigh of something waking up after decades of sleep. I paused, heart pounding. Nothing exploded, no tremor, no water burst. Just the quiet whisper of gravity, doing what it had always done. I turned it another inch. The flow had begun. Up top, the surface wouldn't show anything yet. It would take hours before anyone noticed a change. That was the beauty of it. You couldn't hear water leaving unless you knew where to listen. I climbed out of the vault and stood on the dock. The lake was still stars reflecting on its surface like shattered glass. But I knew what was happening below. The outflow channel hidden beneath the south ridge was open. Water was already sliding through it underground unnoticed. They had no idea. And I wasn't done. I walked back to the cabin, changed into dry clothes, and pulled out my drone again. I launched it into the dark sky, steering it over the lake, getting a live feed shot of the restaurant as it stood proud and oblivious. From above, it looked exactly as it always had, arrogant and misplaced like a crown on a skull. I recorded the timestamp 12:07 a.m. Then I wrote a message. I typed out an email to Cheryl Blake and every member of the HOA board, subject line. Urgent, active drainage underway. In the body, I included a scanned excerpt from the 1982 amended drainage rights, a time-stamped photo of the valve's indicator showing partial open, A warning. This is your final notification. You have constructed an illegal structure on a private retention basin. The drainage system is active. Seek evacuation or suffer the consequences. I didn't send it. Not yet. I scheduled it for 5:30 a.m. By then, it would be too late to stop what was coming. I spent the next few hours preparing evidence, filing backup documents in multiple folders, uploading drone footage, preparing a time-lapse video to be posted on the journalist's blog. The public would know the truth. And if the HOA tried to spin it, I had receipts. At 3 a.m., I walked back to the dock. The water had dropped 6 inches. Still looked normal. But if you watched closely, you could see the exposed shoreline expanding just slightly. Just enough. The restaurant sat a little lower in the water now. Barely noticeable. But I noticed. I walked the perimeter of the lake lantern in hand. At the north bend, the tether anchors had begun to creak under new strain. Their steel cables, now pulling at sharper angles, groaned with every gust of wind. I touched one. It was taut, vibrating like a string on an overplayed cello. I smiled. This was physics. Gravity. Nature reclaiming what had been stolen. By 4:30 a.m., I could see the mudflats breaking the surface near the lily bend. By 5:00, one of the restaurant's stabilizers was partially exposed, listing awkwardly as the flotation system lost equilibrium. And by 5:30, when my email hit the inboxes of Cheryl Blake and her smug cabal, the floating restaurant had begun to tilt. The sun was just starting to rise, casting pale orange across the water. I watched through the drone camera as a worker appeared on deck, rubbing his eyes, coffee in hand, clearly confused by the listing angle of the structure. Then he looked over the rail and froze. Another man joined him, then another. There was pointing, shouting. A cell phone came out. The deck groaned. The northeast corner of the platform dropped another few inches, creating a slow but unmistakable slant. Furniture began to slide across the deck like it was the Titanic's last hour. A canopy structure tore at the bolts, collapsing in a warped heap. I watched it all in silence. At 6:02 a.m., the first drone-captured photo of the collapsing restaurant went live on the HOA Watchdog blog with the headline, "Illegal HOA Restaurant Collapsing After Lake Owner Activates Forgotten Drainage System." By 6:15, the local news station had picked it up. By 6:30, Cheryl had called me 4 times. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood on the edge of the dock, breathing in the cool morning air, the smell of silt and clay rising from the exposed lake bed like truth from deep water. They had ignored the letters. They had dismissed the warnings. They had laughed at the law. Now they were sinking in it. And the lake, my lake, was finally quiet again. By mid-morning, the lake looked like a battlefield. Where once there had been calm blue waters reflecting pine and sky, now there was a wet, glistening basin of mud, scattered debris, and panic. The floating restaurant, which no longer floated, had partially capsized, its left corner buried in soft sludge. The opposite end, twisted and elevated, held up awkwardly by exposed barrels and cracking beams. They had called for cranes. I watched from my porch with binoculars as a convoy of utility trucks, flatbeds, and yellow-jacketed contractors arrived in waves. People shouted over the roaring engines of pumps and portable winches. Someone was already trying to set up a makeshift dam at the outlet pipe, no doubt attempting to stop the water loss. Too little, too late. I didn't say a word. Didn't walk down. Didn't interfere. They wouldn't dare ask me to. The HOA board had officially entered damage control mode. By 10 a.m., Cheryl Blake was giving a statement to a local news crew at the edge of the sloped pathway. I could hear her voice carried faintly by the wind, even before I turned on the drone to capture it. "This is clearly an act of sabotage," she said with faux composure. The community was not informed of any intention to drain the lake, and the destruction of a valuable shared asset, an amenity intended for all residents, will not go unchallenged. She called me out by name, then claimed I had endangered public safety. The news anchor blinked slowly, obviously confused. "But Mr. Holloway owns the lake, doesn't he?" Cheryl hesitated. "That's under legal review." It wasn't. The injunction had come through early that morning. My attorney had called at 7:42 a.m. with the news. The county judge had reviewed all my filings, the title, the anchor point photos, the construction without permit, the HOA's misleading notices, and granted a temporary restraining order. on all further HOA activity concerning the lake or any structure upon it. They were legally barred from continuing construction. They were also liable for the damages. I'd won, but winning didn't feel like I thought it would. It didn't come with a parade or champagne or even relief. It came with mud, with a ripped canopy tangled in the skeletal remains of a dream that never should have been dreamt. It came with the blank stare of a man in a hard hat realizing he wasn't going to be paid for this job. It came with silence, real silence, for the first time in weeks. And then came the letter. I found it taped to my front door that afternoon, hand-delivered by someone too cowardly to knock. No envelope, just a single sheet of HOA letterhead, the same typeface they used for parking violations and trash bin reminders. Mr. Holloway, due to your recent actions and in consideration of the public disturbance and loss of community trust, the board has formally voted to revoke your guest access to all Fresh Pine HOA amenities and events. Your refusal to participate in the community spirit of integration and your continued aggression toward progress are not aligned with the values of Fresh Pine Lakeside. Sincerely, the board. I laughed out loud. Laughed so hard I had to sit down on the porch swing. They were still clinging to the illusion of control, as if they could take something from me. As if the loss of access to a community potluck or a 4th of July fireworks show meant anything to a man who had just brought down their monument to arrogance with one quiet turn of a valve. They didn't own the lake. They didn't own me, but they had tried. And the worst part wasn't their scheming or their entitlement. It was that they never once saw me as a person. Not when they built without permission. Not when they tethered to my land. Not when they stood on the deck of that floating monstrosity and toasted their future. To them, I had been an obstacle, a ghost, an old man with no more power than a patch of unused land. Even after the restaurant collapsed, even after the water was gone, they didn't apologize. They didn't ask what they had gotten wrong. They just tried to punish me for making them look foolish. And that's when I knew I couldn't let it end here. I had to finish it. That night, I emailed my attorney with a simple message. Let's file the full suit. Damages, trespass, defamation. Let's go all the way. Then I went to the basement and opened the footlocker I hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside were photos Sarah and Jake on the dock holding up trout. Sarah sunbathing beside a cooler, her book open, her eyes closed. Jake mid-jump, frozen in the air before his splash. Beneath the photos was a folder thick with legal documents I'd never had to use. Insurance valuations, environmental reports, personal correspondence between Uncle James and the Department of Water Resources. A signed letter from a former state official acknowledging the importance of maintaining the lake as a protected reserve due to its underground aquifer connections. I scanned every page, filed them digitally. Then I printed a statement my own. Not a legal one, a human one. I stapled it to a wooden stake and walked down to the lake bed, now cracked and drying under the late summer sun. I drove the stake deep into the soft mud at the center of what used to be open water. The sign read, "Private property not for sale, not for rent, not for your HOA." And below that, I taped one photo of Jake, his arms wide, his mouth open in laughter, flying off the dock into the water like he owned the sky. Let them come down and read it. Let them look him in the face. The sun dipped behind the treetops, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt clean again. No generators, no music bouncing off the water, no distant laughter ricocheting across the shore like a slap in the face. Just stillness. The kind that presses in around your ribs and makes you realize how much noise you've been tolerating without even knowing it. I sat on the porch swing watching the last slivers of light disappear. The lake, or what was left of it, lay like an open wound beneath the moon. Shriveled, exposed, honest. They called it destruction. Cheryl had even used the word devastation in a public statement that morning, claiming I had willfully vandalized a vital community amenity. I watched her on the local news standing knee-deep in a pair of borrowed boots, pointing to the sunken remains of the restaurant like some kind of flood victim, tears almost welling in the corners of her eyes. But the camera didn't lie. Behind her, where clear water used to shimmer, lay the cracked ribs of the HOA's ambition. Tilted tables, half-submerged speakers, strings of limp decorative lights like vines choking a corpse. I didn't feel sorry. I felt awake. That night, I returned to the valve vault one final time, not to open it, but to close it. The drainage had done its work, too much, and I risked undermining the retaining walls or causing environmental damage to the aquifer beneath. I wasn't trying to destroy nature. I was trying to protect it from people who thought it was theirs to exploit. People who thought beauty was just another asset in a property brochure. I turned the wheel slowly. It resisted grinding like old bones, but it moved. The gauge ticked backward. The flow slowed to a crawl, then stopped. The lake would recover. Eventually. Slowly. Rain would refill what had been stolen. The marsh would seep back in. Nature always took her time. Unlike the HOA. By the time I returned to the cabin, my phone had 22 missed calls and 3 voicemails. One was from Cheryl, her voice low and measured. "Mr. Holloway, you've made your point, but the board is prepared to take legal action if you don't reverse this damage. You're putting yourself in a very precarious position. Let's talk before this gets worse." I deleted it without listening to the rest. The next was from a man board treasurer, I think, a little more aggressive. "You're gonna regret this. You think you're smarter than everyone else. Just wait. We're calling the state. We're calling the press. You just declared war." He wasn't wrong. War had already been declared. But the third message was different. It was from a teenage girl, quiet, nervous, probably one of the residents. I'm not sure if you'll hear this, but I just wanted to say thank you. My dad's been on the HOA board for years, and he never listens to anyone. But we came down to the lake today, and for the first time, he didn't talk. He just looked around, and I think he saw what you meant. So, yeah, just thank you. I sat with that message for a long time. It reminded me of Jake. He would have been 16 this year, probably driving, probably rebelling in his own quiet way. He used to talk about the lake like it was magic. He once asked me if it had a heartbeat. Maybe it did. Maybe this was it. The next morning, Cheryl showed up. Not with the board, not with a lawyer, alone. I heard the crunch of her heels on the gravel path and saw her silhouette against the tree's clipboard in hand, blazer tight over her shoulders. Always dressed for power, even in defeat. She didn't wait for an invitation. Just walked right up to the porch. "Mr. Holloway," she said. I didn't stand. "Cheryl." She looked out at the lake. "So this is it." I followed her gaze. The sun had risen behind the far hill, casting long shadows across the mud. Birds circled overhead, confused. A raccoon pawed at a stranded fish near the old boat launch. Somewhere deep in the basin, a pump creaked, half submerged and broken. "This is it," I replied. She crossed her arms. "Do you have any idea what this will cost the HOA?" I tilted my head. "About as much as it cost me to sit through weeks of being ignored, trespassed on, and lied to, give or take." She sighed. "Look, we both know this is going to court. Maybe civil, maybe criminal. But we don't have to make it ugly. It's already ugly. Then let's make it manageable." I stood then, walked down the steps, and stopped just shy of her. "You know what's funny?" I said. "All this time, not once did anyone from your board knock on my door and say, 'Mr. Holloway, can we talk?' Not one person asked why the lake mattered to me. Not one person thought to check if it was even legally theirs to use." She didn't answer. I continued. "You could have had something beautiful, if you'd asked, if you'd listened. But you came in assuming you could take, and now you've lost everything." She met my gaze, then steadier than I expected. "I didn't think you'd do it. I didn't think I'd have to." She nodded once, tucked the clipboard under her arm. "We'll be in touch." "I know." She turned and walked away. I let her go. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the dry basin and the broken dreams within it, I finally felt something I hadn't felt since before the accident, before the funeral, before the silence. I felt control, not over others, not over land or law, but over myself, over my grief, over the memory of my family, preserved not in photographs or ashes, but in the echo of water, slowly returning to a place it never truly left. The footage went viral before noon. It started with the HOA Watchdog blog, just as I'd planned. The retired journalist, Nancy Hallstrom, had taken my files, videos, scanned permits, and the time-lapse of the draining lake and packaged it into a brutal expose titled, "He warned them." They laughed. Now the lake is gone. Within hours, it spread like wildfire across the local social channels. Then the regional news picked it up. then the national HOA watchdog groups. By sunset, the story had landed on a cable news segment titled Battle at Fresh Pine Lake Homeowner versus HOA. The thumbnail was perfect, a screenshot of Cheryl Blake standing in muddy boots with her hair windblown and eyes red, glaring at the collapsed remains of her floating restaurant, while the headline scrolled beneath, Unpermitted construction sinks after property owner drains his lake. I didn't celebrate. I just watched. I watched as the world finally saw what I had seen for weeks, months even. The arrogance, the denial, the refusal to believe that one man alone could defend what was his. People in the comments called me the Lake Avenger, the HOA Terminator, the last honest man in suburbia. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who'd been pushed too far, a man who did what had to be done. The next day, a news van parked at the edge of my property. They didn't come up. They knew better than to cross the line without permission. Instead, the reporter stood by the newly posted private property sign and recorded a live segment with the drained lake behind her like a battlefield backdrop. I stood just out of frame, arms crossed, watching from the tree line. She glanced toward me once. I didn't wave. Later that afternoon, my attorney called. His voice practically buzzed with adrenaline. "We've got them, Hank. Everything." The judge saw the video, reviewed the anchor points, the tethering. We filed for full restitution and injunctive relief. And more than that, we're filing a countersuit, emotional distress, defamation, and property devaluation. With public opinion in your favor, this board's finished. I didn't say much, just nodded and thanked him. The thing was, I hadn't drained the lake for revenge. I'd done it because they wouldn't stop. Because no letter, no conversation, no legal threat had slowed them. They only understood consequence. And consequence had arrived. What I hadn't expected, what I couldn't have foreseen, was how fast the HOA board began to unravel. 3 board members resigned by the end of the week. Cheryl Blake held on the longest, even gave a second interview, claiming she had acted in good faith under misrepresented land records. But by then, the county zoning office had issued their official ruling. The HOA had 0 jurisdiction over Fresh Pine Lake, and the construction had been carried out in direct violation of local and state codes. They were fined, individually, and the fines were hefty. Residents who had donated to the floating restaurant fund began demanding refunds. Small claim suits started to pile up. A few even showed up at Cheryl's home, banging on her door, screaming about lies and property taxes. And how could you let this happen? One afternoon, I watched her drive past my cabin, slow and wide-eyed, like she was hoping I wouldn't be outside. I was. I stared back. She didn't wave. After she passed, I walked to the waterline. The lake was already beginning to return. Not much. Just a few shallow pools along the southern edge, fed by the underground springs and slow autumn rain. Enough to darken the mud. Enough to draw birds back. Enough to smell like life. A group of kids rode their bikes past the bluff that afternoon. One of them stopped and looked out at the wreckage. "That's the dude," he whispered to his friends. "That's the guy who owns the lake." I turned, raised a hand not to wave, just to acknowledge. They waved back, nervously. Not out of fear, out of respect. The last straw came 2 weeks later. The HOA tried to hold a board meeting at the community center, their first since the collapse. The agenda had been changed last minute to include a motion to discuss disciplinary action against non-participating residents. That meant me. But they never got past the first item. Because half the residents in attendance, armed with printed copies of my drone footage, county rulings, and the HOA's own deceptive flyers, stood up and demanded a vote of no confidence in the board. It passed overwhelmingly. The board was dissolved by the following Monday. I got the news from the same neighbor who had once threatened me over his precious lake views. He stopped by with a basket of late-season tomatoes and a 6-pack of beer. I was wrong, he said, about everything. I nodded. Thanks. We sat on the porch that evening looking over the lake bed. It was quiet again. Peaceful. And it was healing. I had received settlement offers by then, several. The HOA's insurance wanted to avoid trial. The developers who'd helped build the floating platform wanted to make it disappear with a generous check. Even Cheryl, through her lawyer, sent a sealed apology and a figure that made my eyebrows rise. I declined them all, except one. The settlement from the board's insurance provider included two things I needed. 1. A full public admission of wrongdoing. 2. A binding agreement that Fresh Pine HOA would permanently remove Fresh Pine Lake and all its connected parcels from their jurisdiction. I made sure the last line of the agreement read, Fresh Pine Lake and its connected lands are privately held and shall never be subject to future annexation, integration, or amenity development without express written permission of the title holder or their estate. I signed it with my full name, Henry James Holloway, and that was the end of it, at least legally. But healing takes longer. That winter, I began restoring the dock. Just me and a toolbox, some old plans from Uncle James, and long hours spent breathing in the smell of pine and mud and slow-moving water. I sanded the boards, replaced the posts, painted a new bench in memory of Sarah and Jake. Then one morning in January, after a cold night's rain, I stepped out onto the porch and saw it. Water. Not just puddles. A shimmer. The lake was returning, on its own terms, just like I had. Spring arrived slowly, as it always did in this part of the state, hesitant at first, then all at once. The air warmed by degrees. The snowmelt from the highlands filtered down through hidden veins in the earth and the lake. The lake breathed again. It started with a ripple, then a sheet of water spreading like glass poured gently over stone. The basin, once cracked and exposed, softened into a reflecting pool once more. Ducks returned, first cautious, curious, then the frogs, then the herons. The silence that had hung heavy all winter gave way to the songs of crickets and the low, sleepy splash of fish returning to their ancestral beds. I stood on the dock nearly every morning to watch it. Some mornings with coffee, some with nothing but my hands in my pockets and the warmth of Jake's memory at my shoulder. I imagined his voice sometimes telling me the water looked good, asking if the turtles had come back yet. Sarah would have said I went too far. She always believed in giving people a chance, but even she would have admitted eventually that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It had been a theft, and now finally the land was healing from it. The HOA gone, at least in its former form. Cheryl Blake had resigned formally after the final ruling. The insurance settlement had cost them dearly, and a new, smaller advisory board had been elected this time under the direct supervision of the county. Their powers were scaled back. Strictly administrative. No more rogue projects. No more surprise votes. I hadn't attended the election, but the Wilkinsons came by the next day, excited like kids who'd just seen justice in real time. They barred any future development near the lake. Mrs. Wilkinson told me practically bouncing in place. And they gave you an official plaque her husband added, pulling a small wooden board from a brown paper bag. In recognition of Henry J. Holloway for the preservation of Fresh Pine Lake. I thanked them, though I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because it was mine. Because no one had the right to take what a man built from the ground up, especially not when that ground held his grief, his love, and his history. Sometime in May, a young couple knocked on my door. I didn't recognize them at first. She wore a wide sun hat, and he carried a small child in his arms, toddler-aged, bright eyes, golden curls. "We're sorry to bother you," the woman said, "but we read about everything. The lake, what you did, and we just wanted to say thank you." The man nodded. "We live on the far end of Fresh Pine. We didn't even know the HOA was doing half the things they did. We didn't agree with it, but we didn't speak up either." The woman stepped forward gently, holding out a wrapped box. "We made this for you." Inside was a framed watercolor painting. It showed the lake as it looked from my bluff, restored, peaceful, ringed with pine. But in the painting, the water shimmered with faint reflections of two figures in the sky, just hints of form. A boy and a woman, holding hands over the water. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, and they left without asking for anything more. I hung the painting inside the cabin, right above the fireplace where Sarah's photo once sat. Now they were together again, reflected in water. By midsummer, the restaurant wreckage had been removed. I didn't do it myself. The HOA was forced to pay for the cleanup, and I insisted on a professional crew. They came day by day, dragging twisted metal beams and half-submerged supports from the shallows. I supervised from the dock. Not because I needed to, but because I owed it to the lake to make sure it was done right this time. When the last piece was gone, I took a canoe out to the center of the water. just as I had done years before when Sarah first told me she was pregnant. I sat in the middle of the lake and let the silence close around me. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was full. The final hearing was short and brutal. The judge ruled in my favor on every count: illegal construction, property damage, trespassing, defamation, and environmental harm. Cheryl was ordered to pay restitution personally. The remaining board members were cleared, but only because they proved they had been manipulated and misinformed. I didn't push for more. I didn't need to. They had already lost everything that mattered. When Cheryl passed me in the hallway after the ruling, she didn't make eye contact. But as she walked by, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "You could have just said no." I stopped, turned, and replied evenly. I did. The following weekend, I held a small gathering. Just a few neighbors, the Wilkinsons, the young couple, a couple of retired folks who used to fish the lake decades ago. We sat on folding chairs near the dock, grilled burgers, drank beer, and watched the sun go down. At one point, someone asked if I'd ever thought about building something out on the water again. Maybe a small gazebo or a dock extension. I shook my head. The lake doesn't need anything else, I said. It just needs to be left alone. They nodded, and we all sat there watching the reflection of the stars ripple on the water. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about winning. It was about restoring something that never should have been violated in the first place. And in doing that, I'd restored something inside myself too. Peace, clarity, and a quiet reminder that even one person, just one, can stop a tide of arrogance if they stand still enough and refuse to be moved.